Only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, An Expert's Guide to Emergency Action Planning. We're glad you could join us. My name's James. I run webinars and events here at Triumvirate, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I'd like to give you a brief overview on what the webinar is going to entail as we run through a few housekeeping notes. Please note that everyone's microphones are turned off for the entirety of the webinar, but you can ask questions and communicate technical issues by using the questions box over on the right-hand side of your screen. Following today's presentation, there will be an open Q&A period. You can ask questions throughout the webinar by typing them into the questions box, and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar, or we'll save about 10 minutes or so to address those. Any questions we don't get to will be followed up on after the webinar in the coming days. Finally, you will receive a copy of the slide deck and recording of today's event, so all of the materials will be sent to you tomorrow. I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. Kevin Coulon is the Regional Services Director for Field Services and Industrial here at Triumvirate in New England. In this role, he manages the wastewater department, routine field service decontamination, and on-site support. He also manages the emergency response program for all of New England. Kevin provides assessments of facilities from a regulatory standpoint and provides a detailed report findings to help clients reach full environmental and safety compliance. Rick Foote has over 25 years of experience in the EHS industry and is currently Director of Industrial Practice for Triumvirate. Rick's been with the company for over 12 years, where he has established dozens of successful EHS programs for companies that had few or no systems in place. And so now I will turn things over to Rick to start.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everybody. So our key message for today is talking about emergency action planning. Have you planned, implemented, and reviewed, as a training means to make sure that you're ready in case something happens in the event of a true emergency response. We're not just talking about chemicals. We're going to talk about all types of even natural disasters, bomb threats, active shooters, any of those types of emergencies that we're going to focus on today. So with that in mind, our poll question today is, how frequently do you review your emergency action plan?
And just launch that poll. You'll see the options on your screen. Every year, more than once a year, once every few years, or almost never. We'll give everybody a few seconds to respond and share the results. All right, so we're going to push those out, Rick, and it looks like we've got 48% every year, 23% once every few years, 19% more than once a year, and 10% almost never.
Interesting results, especially the nevers. Not surprising. Okay. So our agenda for today is we'd like to go over, just give you a regulatory overview, then we'll talk about emergency action planning, and then how to implement your emergency action plan. That's when I'll be turning it over to Kevin, and how to review your plan, and then obviously a summary and questions. So with that, what I'd like to do on the regulatory review is to talk about your preparedness, also your written plan. So 48% of you say you look at it on an annual basis, which is good, but is it enough? Do you also cover in their training? Are you training people on it every time when you update it? Have you made arrangements with the local authorities, which include the police, the fire, the local hospital, and even emergency response cleanup companies? All of those are part of the regulatory review that we'll talk about. So one of the big questions I get a lot of is, do I need to have a written program for emergency response? And what needs to be in it? A lot of people just say, yeah, we got a plan. What is that? Well, we tell everybody to get out. Well, is that a good plan? Well, it depends on the situation, right? It really should be that your plan is devised more to address every type of situation that could arise. So I always ask everybody, are you ready for OSHA to come in and visit your facility and then inspect your program? Again, we had the high number was 48% to a low of 10%. So everybody in between there is probably going to answer no to that question, right? Is to say, and some of you, I'm sure, have had your plan inspected, and I'm sure OSHA is probably giving you some comments back or forth to say, you know, yes or no, it was good or bad. So as most of you have been aware, OSHA has been busy with their inspections. They've been out there doing them. And from everything I see, and I'm sure some of you will shake your head on this one, even though we can't see you, is to say, yes, you know, they're actually even going to get more busy. So this is why we're focusing on this, is to hopefully make sure that you know and have your plan up to date. So the key to all of this is planning. And that's really what we want to address with you, is to say, does your plan have everything that it should have? So obviously, the key essentials that we feel for this is to really look at everything at your facility. Each one of you has a different type of facility, and you know, here at Triumvirate, as you know, we cover 4 different niches, so everybody's a little different. But you know, really, the key to this, I think, is these bullets that I have here, is you're actually going to look at what are all your hazards, and what ifs. It's a lot of the what if scenarios. What if this happens? What if that happens? And then you've got to figure out what capabilities do you have and what outside resources do you need to have. And when Kevin speaks, he's going to talk more about like doing the drills, which are going to expose even more of that about your capabilities or not your capabilities. So it's kind of the tandem of all of that. And then obviously, once you identified all of that, that all goes into your plan. And then you want to make sure that your plan actually matches up, depending on the community that you're in. Does it match up to theirs? I remember in a previous life that we were a central focal point of the community plan because of all the hazards that we had and the risks that we had at our facility. So then obviously you got to conduct training. 48% of you say you review your plan annually. Well, can I hopefully 100% of that 48% have said that they've done annual training then. Because if you change the plan, you got to train people on what you changed on the plan. So again, have you shared that with the local authorities? Have you talked to the local fire department, the local police? Do you know what they're going to do? Who's going to do what? A key question I ask a lot, and I'm sure Kevin will say yes to this too, is I always say, is the fire department going to take over when they show up, or do they just stand there and spray water on it, as I had one fire chief tell me once? To me, that's an important thing that's part of your emergency planning. Do drills and more drills. Make sure your people know what to do. And then audit your whole procedures. What are you going to do? How are you going to do it? When are you going to do it? Because again, as we learn from our mistakes in the past, how do we increase them so they don't happen in the future? You know, God forbid, there's been a lot of historical, you know, terrible incidences, you know, that occurred over the last 10, 15 years that we've learned from, and we all should look at our own facilities and kind of figure out, does that work for us? So with that in mind, obviously, the OSHA regulation, I'm sure all of you are aware, right, is 1910-38, and it says that, you know, right in the regulation, it says what? Is to facilitate, and organize your employer and employee actions during an emergency. So a lot of people interpret that as just being chemicals, and I'm always like, no, it's everything. It's any type of an emergency. Again, though, you know, you want to make sure you keep the plan simple. As they say, why do we want it simple? Because if you make it super complicated, you're never going to meet the intention of the plan, and employees themselves are going to get confused. And that's a key thing, that you want to make sure that they actually understand it and that you train to the plan and with the plan. And obviously, you're not going to, like I always say to everybody, it's not like you're going to take the plan out during an emergency, but you are going to look at the plan hopefully after the incident and say, okay, no, that didn't work. We need to tweak our plan. So that's making the changes as goes along, because this is a constant, you know, development. It's something that should be a living, breathing document. So again, and then you got to make sure your employees know what you put in the plan. How does it affect them? What do you expect them to do? I was recently at a facility where they're like, oh yeah, these people are our fire wardens, and we did a drill, and guess what? None of them knew that they were a fire warden, so they all went outside. And they were all listed in the plan. And I was like, did you train them on it? They're like, we told them. Is telling them or training is a big difference. So that's something you want to make sure you pay attention to. Obviously, the biggest priority you have is accountability. So, you know, if you need to evacuate the building, or even if you evacuate in place, you've got to have some system in place to ensure that all employees are accounted for. I always say not just employees, what about contractors? What about vendors? What about other people that may be in your building? How do you keep track of them? How do you know who's in the building? This is all part of your planning. And I love doing this, and I'm not sure if Kevin will mention this or not, but we always train people, right? This is the path you go out. This is your main emergency egress. Well, I love blocking off that emergency egress and see how people react. To me, that's always a fun exercise in the sense of what do people do? And sometimes people, I've seen them go right through caution tape. I've seen them just go, walk right into the situation. So it's good to kind of practice this and make sure they know what they're doing. Obviously, the second half of it here is, to reduce any structural or facility damage. Obviously, people are irreplaceable. So, always the structure itself is the least thing of importance. So, as OSHA says, what do you need to have actually in your plan? So in there, again, you can have it either written or oral emergency action plans. And again, if you have 10 or less employees, you are allowed to orally communicate this to employees. However, I always say too, yeah, is that a good system? Well, if you only got 2, 3, 4 people, or it depends on the size of the facility. So if your facility is larger, can you really yell, across the entire facility to tell somebody there's an emergency? Or so it might be better to say, yeah, let's put everything in writing. Let's let everybody know exactly what our rules are and to know that this is what we expect you to do. And a key thing here, too, is also that this plan is supposed to be available to your employees for review. That is something I know when I'm out auditing, I very rarely see that this is open to the public, if you will, if it's hung up somewhere or something like that, where employees can literally walk up to it and say, oh, okay, that's what I'm supposed to do. Which is kind of the intent here is, again, to constantly put it in front of them. You really want to make sure that your employees know what their roles and responsibilities are in this program. Again, you don't know what you don't know, which is a key thing, so you want to make sure that employees are aware of what they need to do. Okay, so also in here is you need to have procedures for how do you report for a fire or any other type of emergency. Now, other emergencies can cover the full gamut. This includes what I mentioned earlier, bomb threats, things like bomb threats. How about hurricanes? Earthquakes. I used to joke, being here in New England, yeah, we never get earthquakes, right? Until, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago now, Kevin, right? 4 or 5 years ago, when we had an earthquake, I remember I was in New Jersey, and I'm like, what the heck was that? And somebody who was with me had lived in California and said, that was an earthquake. I had never felt one in my life, and it was a little concerning at first. So we got to be prepared for everything, and your emergency action plan should detail out all of these different types of events and exactly what you're going to do or what the plan is. So everything from like a toxic gas leak, if that's something at your facility, to, I hate to say the words, but an active shooter today, that's an emergency. Those rules are constantly changing as far as what the authorities think you should or shouldn't do. So it is something that, again, a fluid document would kind of cover that information. You also want to make sure in there how you're going to get people out. What type of evacuation? What are the exit routes assignments? Do they change? A lot of your facilities change the layout of the land. How often are you updating the plan or even your evacuation maps? All of these things are very, very important as to let your employees know that this is what they need to do. Have you identified any critical plant operations? Things that could blow up, things that are, major life support, especially in healthcare. There's a lot of, critical operations. Because again, and this one's tough because people always ask, well, what's a critical plant operation? It's very subject to your facility. Like it's something that, something else could go really, really bad if you don't do something. So, but you got to make these employees aware that they are a part of that critical operation, and how do you protect them? So that's all going to be part of your procedure also. And most importantly, I think is the last one, is the one that I see the least that is done, is how do you account for all your employees? I hear it constantly from people, well, how do we do that? We're an office, we don't have a way, really. Well, we got 200 people. How do we account for 200 people? You got to come up with a system. There's so many different systems out there today. Some of them are, yes, time cards, right? People wave in and out on the proximity cards. That's one system, right? Other systems are, okay, you got a head check, right? You got a list of names. I've seen that done where everybody, goes to the designated area, and then you have your roll call, and then you have your visitor sign-in logs. There's a lot of different systems. You've got to figure out which one works best for your facility, and you can't just say, oh yeah, we just do, we just know. Well, how do you know? How do you know that that person isn't there? And I always stress it to everybody is, you're going to put somebody else's life in jeopardy because they're actually going to go in the building searching for somebody that maybe went to Dunkin' Donuts, right, to get a coffee, and they didn't tell somebody. That's what we run into a lot, is more the office personnel that I think is the bigger issue with that, not so much the, the worker bee, if you will. So again, you also want to detail in here, are you expecting any of your employees to do any rescue or medical duties? Again, they got to be properly trained in how to do this. And it's okay to say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to rely on the fire department, or we're going to rely on, the ambulance service or the hospital or whatever it is that the setup is that you have, at your facility to ensure this is going to go properly and the way you want it to go. You also have to have the name or the job title of every employee who's going to be contacted if anything were to happen, and what is their duty. So what do you expect them to do? So obviously you're all going to have an emergency coordinator, an incident commander, whatever title you want to use. To me, it's irrelevant, but it's all about, okay, what is that person's duty? What do you expect them to do? Everything all the way down to floor sweeps, or whatever terminology you use. I've seen fire wardens, I've seen, every different name in the book on these. But what it's really all about is to say, okay, what do we expect them to do? How do we expect them to do it? And then, most importantly, do they have the proper training for what they need to do? Because a lot of this comes down to emergency action planning, especially as an emergency coordinator. It's going to link back to a different OSHA regulation, which is the HAZWOPER regulations, Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response, which, again, if you're going to be emergency coordinator, you better be trained in that, because that is something that OSHA looks for. They're going to want to know, how do you do it? And not to mention also, you're probably going to have to get trained under a whole different regulation, right, which is hazardous waste, because if it's a chemical, now you got to have hazardous waste training. So all of these duties are covered in this document, and it's going to say this is how you do it, and this is what your responsibilities are, along with details about the training that these particular people get to ensure that they're doing their job correctly and efficiently. And this can change. And to me, this is one of the major areas that when you're reviewing your plan, you need to look at and say, okay, does that job duty still really fit? Or does it go to shift to somebody else? And then do they have all the right training? Is their training up to date? Because again, there's multiple links to this program into many other OSHA programs, which probably between Kevin and I probably name every OSHA regulation, right, that's somehow connected to this in one form or another. So it is important that you think about that. So training. Training is, again, the key. And the whole idea behind the training is to designate and train your employees to obviously help to evacuate the building. Because any of you that have done this, or anybody that's ever been involved with an emergency situation, knows, I like to use a technical term, right? What happens to the brain? Most people's brain turns to mush, right? That is my technical term for it, right? Because people panic. People don't know what to do. So they're looking for that calm person to help them process this in their brain to say, okay, all right, I got to get out. And one of the classic situations that I recall personally was, I remember when we had a small fire at my company, and we were having a thunderstorm at the same time. It was thunder and lightning outside, so of course people didn't want to go outside, right? But then they realized, oh my God, there's a fire. And we found out that an employee was deathly afraid of thunder and lightning. This person literally got down in the fetal position on the ground and would not go outside. It was something we didn't plan, something we didn't even think about. Where somebody had a handicap, if you will, that they couldn't address, and we had to come up with a way and say, wow, thank God we had an employee that was very calm, very soothing, and got this person into a safe area inside the building that we used as a safe haven, if you will, and it worked out perfectly. And so in the future, we used to ask people, is there anything we should be aware of on how you react during an emergency? And we got a list of different things that some people were, definitely afraid of this or whatever it was. There was all these little things that came out of it, and we addressed every single one of them on an individual basis, not to intrude with anybody, personal information, but it really helped us to design our plan to ensure we covered everything. So you also got to make sure that you're reviewing the plan. And again, I'm going to hop back on the 48% number, because that number is, concerning, I guess, to me. I was hoping we got over 50, that at least annually. But you got to review the plan anytime, any single time anything changes. You've got to update your plan. That could be everything from job title changes, personnel changes, changes in the layout of the facility, changes in the risk. We all look at it. People usually look at it, right, on a chemical risk or HAZCOM. Okay, well, did that have an effect because now you brought in a new chemical? Did that change some of your risk? So therefore, then you got to review your plan. And if you review your plan, obviously, now you got to train everybody back on it again. So it's a constant evolution, and especially with phone numbers today, too. I've had inspectors that will stand there and take out their cell phone and start dialing numbers, that are in your emergency action plan, because they want to know, okay, is this person really valid? And I've seen them call people. I remember once when one of the funniest ones was, well, I don't know if it was really funny, but they picked up the number and they started calling the guys, oh, he's been deceased for a couple of years. So that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing that you recognized it and you didn't do anything about it. So it is something that you want to make sure of. Okay. OSHA has actually come up with some really good tools also that can help you with this. And I put it up here. This is the home page, and hopefully most of you are aware of the e-tools that OSHA has developed. And I wanted to bring some focus to it, is to say, you can go right on here, and it asks you a series of questions, and it'll help you to kind of figure out, all right, do I really need an emergency action plan? Which I'm going to say probably 99.9% of you on this call, yes, you need one. So it's going to help you, though, to kind of evaluate and do some of that evaluation if you walk through the process with it. It's a good starting tool. This is not like designed to be everything. This is not designed to make your emergency action plan. It's really just to help you to get started. Because I don't know about you, but I know me, I always need something to get me going, and this is a great tool in which to use to get yourself started into doing your emergency action plan. So if you look on this next slide here, again, it's got basically everything that we talked about here, is right here. It's actually, this tool will say, okay, we're going to make you walk through almost this entire process, and this is what you need. It'll give you a skeleton plan. I want to stress it's a skeleton plan. There's still a lot of work that you need to do on your end to make it site-specific. Every emergency action plan should be site-specific. I've seen larger corporations where they say, okay, here's an emergency action plan for all of our facilities in the United States. Great, that's the basics. But what happens in Virginia versus California versus Minnesota versus here in Massachusetts is totally different. Different regulatory worlds, different local regulations, different fire departments, different everything. So it needs to get to be that specific and when you're writing your plans. You really want the more detail that is can be as specific as possible in the detail is going to make your plan very, very efficient. And it actually will help during the case of an emergency. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to talk about drills. Kevin?
Thanks, Rick. So for the next half of the presentation, we're going to talk about how to implement an emergency action plan, how to review your plan, how to actually do a tabletop, and how to do a full-on scale mock drill. It is a lot to cover in 25 minutes, but hopefully we can give you a good idea of where to start to set up your next drill from your emergency action plan. The first question that you need to ask yourself is, who's going to be involved? And this is really going to come from your emergency action plan. So you're going to go through and you're going to identify who are your internal emergency response coordinators. You could identify them as coordinators. They could be commander chiefs. They could be chiefs. You could use whatever language you want to call them in your plan. But if they are going to be an incident commander, as Rick had talked about earlier, there are some OSHA regulations around being a true IC for an emergency response. The fire department may be involved. You may also have the police department, and you may also have a response company involved. It could be a hazardous materials response company. It could be like a service master type company that's going to come in if it was a flood. But some questions you have to ask yourself when deciding who's involved is, do they even know that they're involved in your plan? Have you put somebody's name in your plan and they have no clue that they're in there? And then, do you know who they are? So if you're writing the plan, you should know these people as you're putting them in there. And one thing that I've seen is there'll always just be one number. And it's best if you can get two numbers for somebody to have an alternate phone number. There are some states that have actually started to push to have a home address in there as well. And this actually came up at one facility that I've done work with where there was an emergency that happened. They couldn't get a hold of them, and the police showed up at their house and escorted them because they couldn't get a hold of them. But the police department went to the plan, had their address, and went and got them and told them there's an emergency at their plant. So from knowing who should be involved, you then want to go and identify the scenario. And you may want to pull in the people that you list in your plan to help identify a scenario you want to go through. You want to try and make this so that you can turn a worst case scenario into a best case scenario. You want to have risk association, so it's not just let's do it on a hurricane. What other issues might come with a hurricane? Could you have a power outage? Could there be thunder and lightning? As Rick talked about earlier, they ran into an issue with somebody who was deathly afraid of it. What type of response are you going to have? Who's going to show up? Is it purely just an evacuation of people, or are you going to have fire department involved as well? And then the one curveball that's always out there is the public. So you've evacuated your own people, you've gotten them out of the building, but now you have onlookers. You have the people that'll come up and they're going to start asking questions, and they can sometimes get in the way of what you're trying to do to keep your people safe, because now you have individuals which would be similar to a visitor, but they have no clue as to what your emergency action plan says or what they should be doing while they're outside the facility. So to set up a tabletop, which will then come into a full mock drill, is you have to identify the scenario. So you want to choose a scenario that'll best suit your company at a given time. And this could definitely change with the seasons depending on where you are. If you're in the Northeast, well, we have 4 full seasons. Your scenario is going to be a lot different in the summer than it is in the winter. The winter, you may be worrying about wind chill factor, you might have frostbite, you might have snow, you could have ice on the ground, and in the summer, you may have to be worrying about putting up shade tents so people don't get heat exhaustion while standing out in the sun. There's also other scenarios besides just the seasons. You could be in an area that has tornadoes. I can remember when I was working at our Connecticut branch, we had 2 tornadoes come through. It went through the town that was right next to me. It was never heard of to have them in Connecticut, but now there's tornadoes. And a couple years later, we had them go right through Springfield. And there were actually buildings that had to evacuate them, and those buildings actually didn't have tornadoes written into their emergency action plan. If you're down south, you could have hurricanes. There could be earthquakes, as Rick mentioned earlier. Earthquakes don't happen in New England, but they're happening more frequently now. It could be a flood, could be a fire, it could be a shooter. I actually just did a mock drill for the AHMP down in Washington, D.C., and we did a drug lab, showed up at a hotel. And how can you plan for that? You don't know it's going to happen, but do you close off access to your parking garages so that that scenario couldn't happen? You could also have a power outage, and you could also have a snow emergency. What happens if the state calls a snow emergency? What do you do with all your people to get them home safe? What if the roads are closed and you can't get them home safe? Do you have that built into your plan? So after identifying the scenario, how do you complete the tabletop drill? We talked about who should be involved. We talked about identifying the scenario. So the tabletop starts with the scenario and the steps taken by you in the response to the emergency. So this is where you will take a situation and you're going to invite the fire department in. You may invite the police department. You may invite your emergency response company. Some people might want to invite the ambulatory company to come in case you have an injury. But you get everybody into a room and you start to talk through the scenario. Putting it on so you're the IC at that time. You're going to be the main contact for doing the tabletop. You should be having somebody set up as a note taker. They want to take attendance for everybody. They want to take notes of any questions that come up. And they want to get a whole entire list of everything that went on during that tabletop so we can review the entire process. You want to have somebody who's going to redirect public. So you may be assigning somebody in your facility that they're going to be in charge of the public. You may also have somebody that's in charge of visitors. If you're a large facility, you have multiple departments, and I've worked with multiple companies where they have a lead for each department. You may want to have those leads at the tabletop. Now, if this turns into having 50 people in a room, you may have to dial it back. You may have to do one internally and then one with everybody else. But as many people as you have involved in the plan or they're written into the plan should really take part in the tabletop so they can actually look at it and say, that really doesn't make sense. Maybe we need to update this. So after you've identified your people and your steps, gaining the estimated response time, so when you have your fire department, police department, response company on site, you want to ask them, if this happened at 3 p.m. and it's rush hour, how quickly can you get here? Well, your police department and fire department, that may be minutes because they're going to have sirens. They can get right through traffic. But your emergency response company most likely will not have that. So how quickly will they get there? At rush hour, it may be 2 hours. At 12 o'clock noon, it may be 45 minutes. So start to understand how long it'll take to get there. And then go through each vendor. If you want to call your fire department and police department and response company as a vendor, you want to ask them who their main contact will be. And then when they show up, what role are they going to take? Rick had mentioned earlier, will the fire department just show up or are they going to put water on it? Mm-hmm. Or in the case I had mentioned, we did a mock drill down in DC. Well, DC Fire Department also had a DC hazmat team. Maybe your town has a hazmat team, and they're going to show up to every emergency. Now, the fire chief for the hazmat team said, I will be the IC as soon as I get on site, and I will take the full IC role, and everybody will report into me. So now it's your drill, but you're reporting up to the fire department. So you want to get those chain of command ironed out before you even go in and do a mock drill. You also want to talk about what level of response will they conduct. If it's a fire, small fire, maybe you'll get one fire engine. If it's a full building, you're going to get 10 fire trucks that show up. It's really going to depend on how big that fire is. But if you go into something like a tornado or a hurricane or a snow emergency or even a chemical response, which we haven't been talking much about chemicals because emergency action plan covers everything, including chemicals, but everything beyond. And most often people will practice with their chemicals. What do you do if you have a spill? But it's everything else that sometimes people are not ready for or familiar with. So if it's a hurricane, how many are going to show up? You may also need to look at, if I have a hurricane or I have a tornado and I need to evacuate people, how am I going to get people safely to where they need to be? Are you going to have everybody get in their car and have a mad dash to get outside your parking lot? Or are you going to have somebody set up as a potential bus company that you could call to have them transported? And then the other thing you want to do is ask what questions they have. because you should have already sent your emergency action plan to all the parties that are in your drill, in the tabletop drill. And you should hope that they have read through everything and they can start and have questions ready for when they show up. And that's something you may want to put in the invite when you send them, as you set up, if you do a calendar invite, is please read through and come with questions on the plan. When you start it, have a copy of the emergency action plan. Some places may have a contingency plan, some may have both. Have it at the meeting for reference. Like we talked about, having a note taker to write down questions and comments on the response program, and then be detailed with your response for the tabletop. So something that could be detailed is if you have a spill, let's say you had a chemical spill outside, will you cover storm drains? If the answer is yes, and now you have a storm coming in, well, now you may have a flood. So you have your chemical release, and you also have a potential flood from the rain that's coming in. So now you have two different parts of your emergency action plan you have to follow. Are you going to block off the area? Are you going to evacuate people, and are you going to close off the doors and they can't get into the facility? You're going to block off portions of the parking lot because you know that fire department's coming in. And will you take any preventative measures? If it's in the winter, are you going to have an area that's set up that you can put people in? Maybe it's your next door neighbor. If you have a company that's next door, do you have something set up that you can evacuate your people and they can go into your next door neighbor's building so that they have a heat source? Now, if you have 2,000 employees all in one building, it may require you to reach out to multiple different companies. Maybe you have 10 neighbors, and certain departments go to each neighbor's building, and they've assigned you a room that you can use. So those are people that you want to communicate to. If it's in the summer, you may have to look at, do you have a shaded spot for people? Or if it's very hot, I remember going to a conference down in Scottsdale, Arizona, and it was 127 degrees out. You can't have everybody standing outside in that, so are you going to have a neighbor's facility that has air conditioning you can go into? That could even be part of your emergency action plan. If you're in a very high temperature area and the AC goes and your building's going to continue to heat up, do you need to move your staff to a new facility? After you've met with everybody, you want to do a post-tabletop. You want to send a recap out to all the attendees, list out everything that was covered, list out all the questions. You want to update any internal programs based on the recommendations. And you want to issue out a new plan if you made any changes to people. And you're also going to have to set up a training based off those changes. And from the tabletop, now you go to put this in motion. So you plan a live emergency drill. When you're planning this emergency drill, you want to set the stage. You want to inform parties of a possible drill. And by informing parties, you may want to call, and this came up, I said we did the drill in DC. We actually called the local 911 and informed them that we were going to be doing a drill in case any of the people staying at the hotel called 911, because there was some noise that was going on with it. There were people in suits, there were people in respirators, and someone may look outside and say, there's something going on, I'm going to call 911 to be a good citizen. So if you are doing a drill, that may be a phone call you want to make, that if you get a call from our facility, we're running a mock drill, and just explain to them what you're running. So if something else does come in, let them know that it is real, but it could be a possibility that it's a drill. You want to put the drill in motion, and then you want somebody to be taking notes. When you identify the setting, it could be a flood, could be a spill, could be a fire, could be a hurricane. You may want to use props, and in some cases you may want to use volunteers as affected individuals. Somebody's passed out from heat while they were standing outside. You may want to throw a curveball in there. You have people standing out in the heat, and you have a couple that act faint, and see what people will do to get them to a cooler area. And will you have response companies on site, or you have local authorities when you do the drill? And I would suggest having both. Inform parties of the drill. The exact date and time is not needed. You don't have to tell them the date and time that it's going to happen. If you want to do a full test on your program and your responders, what you may want to do is give them a time frame. We're going to run our drill, and it's going to be between September 23rd and September 30th of 2016. And that gives them an idea that we may get a phone call, they're prepared, but you're not giving them the exact date and time that it's going to happen. And like I said about 911, they did this at the hotel we were doing the drill at. They called and said if something does get called in, it's because we're running a drill on a mock drug lab that showed up in our parking lot. The type of drill is not needed. You don't have to give out what drill you're going to be covering with people, and then identify what parties you think you're going to call. So this is you doing your pre-planning stages to run your mock drill. Then you want to put the drill in motion. You have your live scenarios called within the company. Could be a fire drill. Maybe you want to practice for an active shooter. You want to assign somebody to call for help and to take attendance. Because if you're the incident commander, you're the one that's guiding the ship. You shouldn't be making all the phone calls. You shouldn't be meeting the emergency response company. You shouldn't be checking to see if people are okay. You want to assign that to other people and make sure that those people are coming back to you and reporting back on what's going on at a routine frequency. So maybe set every 20 minutes they want to hear from you. At least for the first 5 minutes, I want an update every I want 2 updates within the first 5 minutes and then 20 minutes after that. And then have your note taker to observe the ER and observe the public. And if it's going to be a large one, and if you have multiple people involved, you may want multiple note takers. So these people are just sitting there and they're going to write down what people did and what they didn't do. And from the tabletop, you should have a good idea of what people should be doing. And you want to give those notes to the person who's taking the note taker that they can review what steps people are taking based off of what was said would be done in your tabletop. The other thing is timing the response. I'm sure everybody can remember days of elementary school or high school when they'd run fire drills. And we'd all get called back in and we'd either get everybody did good or it took too long to get people out, and we need to be better. We said we'd get everybody out of the building in 2 minutes and it took 10. So time the response. How long does it take your company to get out? How long does it take for responders to get on site? And how long did it take to protect the facility and or the environment? Now, number one is always going to be protecting the public and protecting your employees. So the facility is going to come last. But if you can protect all of your employees, protect the public, and then your next step is protecting the facility, then you can start working on your facility. So now that you've had a mock drill that you've put in place, you then pull everybody back together and you need to review the plan. And by reviewing the plan is you're going to review that drill that you just did. So you reviewed it after you did the tabletop, and now you're reviewing it after doing an actual drill. And part of this is to help update your plan. You want to invite all parties back that came for the drill. If other parties came in during the drill that you didn't plan for, like somebody called an ambulance and they showed up, well, ask if they want to be part of the drill, part of the review. So have them come back. Review the observations of each group. So if you had one note taker, review everything from that person who's taking notes. But if you have a certain note taker for each group or for each person that was in charge, bring them all back and they can step through and walk through what people did and what they may have missed. You want to make changes to your program or anything that was updated or people suggested, and you need to retrain as needed. So if you change your plan, you need to retrain all of your people to the new plan. So again, our key message with emergency action plans these should be planned, they should be implemented, and reviewed and trained according to educate everybody on that plan. Make sure you have everybody involved for the appropriate response in the event of a true emergency, and make sure everybody is completely familiar with the plan that you have. So with that, we turn into the ability to open it up for questions. I know we crammed a lot in for the last 50 minutes, but if anybody has any questions at all for either Rick or myself, we'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you, Rick. We do have about 10-12 minutes or so to spend on questions. Before we get to that, I want to talk a bit about our follow-up to this webinar and what you can expect in the days ahead. So we'll advance to that last slide and provide some contact information and some next steps there. So while we're going through this, it'll take a minute. Get your questions in for Kevin and Rick, and we'll field those and get to what we can with the time allowed. So tomorrow, for those of you that signed in a bit late, we're going to be sending the presentation over as well as a link to the recording. So you can view this, watch it at your convenience. We'll also include a link to a survey, short 5-question survey. We'd appreciate your feedback and let us know if you have any ideas for improvement or webinar topics for the future. There will also be a quick question at the end of this webinar when you sign off, and would appreciate your response to that. Also, what you heard today is not just theory. As Kevin and Rick explained, this is work we've done for clients, and would love to speak to you about your emergency response program and any opportunities for improvement. So there's a number there. I'm also going to shoot over a link, since the one on the slide is not clickable, if you want to explore our website and some of the ER services that we provide. Finally, we've got an email address for Rick and Kevin. Feel free to reach out. I know they'd be happy to connect with you and answer any questions you have following today's presentation. I know it was a lot of information to digest, but I hope you found it valuable. So great, guys, we've got a couple of questions. I'm going to do another call here for anyone who wants to submit with the time we have left. And Kevin, let's throw this one to you. How often should I conduct mock drills? Do you have a best practice there?
In my experience working with companies, the best frequency is at least annually. But if you're an area that could have multiple different scenarios that would come up, you may want to do it more frequent. So let's say, up here in New England, you have 4 different seasons. So we may do it 4 different times. Or you may only do it twice. So you do the 6 warm months with the 6 cold months. So you do a scenario in the cold, and you do a scenario in the warm months. I would say best manager practice at least once, but if you have multiple scenarios, you may want to do it more than once.
Great, good recommendation. Thanks, Kevin. Rick, this one's for you. Regarding the do I need a plan, the regulations are fairly straightforward in answering that question, but it's often somewhat confusing if a fire prevention plan is involved. So how does one determine if an EAP or an FPP or both are required?
It all comes down to what do you have at your site. Most cases, both are required. If you have flammable liquids on site, you need a fire prevention plan, which some people choose to incorporate it into their emergency action plan. And as long as you are covering all of the elements for both plans, you can just have one. But it comes down to what do you have on site for materials that would require it, which, like I said, is mainly around the flammables and those types of items.
Great, thank you, Rick. We've got a couple more here. Kevin, we talked a bit about who should be involved in the mock drills. Should a hospital be present or on site for the drill?
Not necessarily, but there are some companies that request that they show up. There may be a situation where you actually need a doctor to show up to the site. Maybe you have multiple people that are hurt or that are injured. Maybe something happened at your facility where it's more than just one person injured, and you're going to have some ambulances coming to take people to the hospital, and you may request that they send medical staff to the site to help with all your other people that are injured or affected. So if you were going to run a drill similar to that, then you may want to have the hospital. But in about 95 to 98% of all mock drills, the hospital has not been involved. Ambulatory companies have been involved, but not so much the hospital. You may want to let the hospital know you're running a drill, though, if you're actually going to transport people or bring people to the hospital, go through the whole thing to see, will they be prepared when you show up with this many people? That type of scenario has happened, and that's just a phone call to let them know it's happening. But to have them on site, it's not completely necessary.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying. And I've got one last question in the queue. We could take another one or two if there are any out there. Let's. This is for both of you. We'll start with Rick, and it's from Glenn. How do you get employees to take the EAP seriously?
Tell them their life depends on it. I usually try to share horror stories, of things that have happened, historically, and to really explain that this truly can save your life. We've looked at the risk, really reiterated to them all the different risks that occur at that facility, and then share with them an actual example of something that did happen elsewhere. And most times that resonates with people is when they hear, wow, this actually did happen, and it's not just the pie in the sky type of an attitude. That usually works well with most people. And even, I hate to say it, but sometimes graphic pictures, also helps reinforce that information.
Just from a getting somebody involved, if they're not buying into the emergency action plan, try and get them involved with the mock drills.
Yes.
Get them to see what actually happens, because sometimes the experience is going to get them to buy into it. You are going to have circumstances where you've tried getting people involved, you've given them graphic pictures of what could happen, and they still just don't buy in. That will happen with some individuals. I remember responding to a chemical spill that actually got into the exhaust system, and they had to evacuate an entire building. And one of the professors who was at a school needed to get his work done, said he uses this chemical all the time. So he snuck in a back door that wasn't blocked off. He went up an emergency exit. He went up through the emergency stairs. There were the back doors to the labs, which had prep rooms, and he snuck in through there, and as we did a sweep and we were in with the fire department, we found him in there eating his lunch and doing his work at his computer. And it took the fire department and the police department coming in to get him to evacuate. And his work was worth more than the potential risk of getting injured. And you'll run across those people, and unfortunately we're all going to see it. You'll have those people that do it. But if you can try and get them involved by doing the mock drills, doing the tabletop, sometimes that experience will help change their outlook on the emergency action plan.
Thanks, guys, for responding to that last question. We're gonna start to wrap up here. We've got 5 minutes left, so we'll give everybody a few minutes back to their day. Thank you all for attending. Really enjoyed the questions. Rick and Kevin, thanks for sharing your expertise and some really vivid examples that I hope our attendees can learn from. So again, don't be shy. Feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to work with you. Anything else to add, guys, before we shut down today?
No, I just hope, if everybody can stay on their emergency action plan, we'll be able to keep everybody safe.
Plan, plan, plan.
There you go. Can't say it enough, Rick. Thank you, guys. Take care, everyone, and we hope to see you soon on one of our next webinars. Take care. Bye.